Thank you. Ευχαριστώ πολύ. I will be modifying what I prepared for this conference because so much has been said already, and I will try to say certain things that I simply wanted to articulate in light of what has been said. The problematic status of the holy canons of the Orthodox Church's ecumenical councils is best known to those who have attempted to teach the history of these councils to children. Anyone who has tried to explain the relevance of these councils and their canonical legislation in a classroom today will know that this is no easy task. Indeed, that these meetings or councils are somehow important for us today, meetings summoned over 1,000 years ago by emperors of a no longer extant empire on the territory of today's Turkey, is a lofty proposition that does require some explaining. You don't have to explain it to adults because we take this for granted, but for children, if you can imagine somebody, I taught, religion or catechism in a Saturday school in Munich, children who were born and raised somewhere in another country. This is very far removed from their reality. And sometimes when you explain things to children, you begin to realize what the problematics are also for adults who newly enter the church. Now, what makes the task so difficult today is not the theology articulated by the councils. Although the complexities of Trinitarian and Christological controversies are admittedly difficult subject matter for any age group, at least their relevance today goes without saying. The dogmatic formulations of the councils are unchanging truths, and they are, of course, as relevant today as they were then, although our way of articulating them, our language, of course, changes. The truly difficult part of the story is the disciplinary legislation, or canons promulgated by the councils, which concern everything from how men and women may dress or wear their hair to the inter-hierarchical status of the Bishop of Constantinople. Now, when I make the distinction between certain disciplinary legislation and theological truths, I would like to just summarize what the actual underlying difficulty is. And I think that we have been talking around this topic all the time, and I've talked about it with several people during lunch, that basically tradition always consists of stands sort of on two pillars. One pillar of tradition is the mystery, and the other is history. And it seems that all of our church controversies and also our discussion here today is always that some people tend to stress the mystery, like what Metropolitan Zizoulas was saying about Trinitarian theology and the relevance to the church. And then there will be the side, it's again Antioch versus Alexandria, the history, the historical school, and then there is the tendency to exaggerate the mystery and disregard the history. So every heresy, or certainly the Christological ones, had to do with this dynamic. And it's always a challenge for the church to find a balance, because actually both of them are important, because we're dealing with the divine human organism of the church, and that antinomy, actually, that there is the divine and the human, and that they have to interrelate. And both do have a tension. There's a tension all the time between the two. So the fact that we have problems in discerning what should be more important or how to keep a balance, this has always been a problem. And I think that with the canons today, we seem to have we have a problem in recognizing that historical side. It's a simple fact that there is a historical side to this. All of tradition has history and mystery, because the mystery is revealed to us in history. That's the whole mystery of the Incarnation. The whole radical aspect of Christianity is that it was revealed in history. And there is a changeable part of that, how it's revealed and how it's passed on in tradition already, because language changes. And that medium is a human medium that changes. And this cultural reality is also this reality is expressed in something like the canons. And I think that when we tend to deny the historicity and the historical aspect and changing aspect of the canons, we are in danger of what Florovsky saw as an ahistorical approach to Christianity that really threatens to turn our little world, and it is becoming an ever smaller world of the church, into some kind of a mythology. And children sense this immediately. And, you know, they sort of show us with their feet when they get older. There's an American expression that people vote with their feet. They simply don't go in the direction of the church because it becomes, they don't want to, you know, they might want to go to Disneyland when they're little, but they don't want to play dress up and go to a world that's not relevant or that's not even speaking their language anymore. We're not creating a bubble in the church. It's part of real, it is life. The church is life. It's not a, we can't have a dualism. You know, there's the real world, and then there's our protected world that never changes. It's not the way it is. So with the canons, I think it seems to be that we are struggling to find a balance. And then, of course, I just want to mention before I go on, I realize my limitations of time. There is also a general subject that we keep talking around. The prospect of changing the canons has to do with the crisis of authority in the church, that it was also spoken by great theologians of the 20th century, that we have a general feeling of the demise of the ability to create something new. You know, there's the golden era of the fathers, and then this kind of idea, which is even stronger in the Latin West, of that it's not really possible for us to do the same. It's a latent lack of faith in the existence of the church, as if the Holy Spirit has left the church. And we really don't believe deep inside, how can we touch the holy canons? Well, the church created them in the first place. They created them in time and space. They didn't fall down. And the church created them, and the church lives on. Does the church exist today? Yes. Do we believe in the church? That means that what the church was capable of at that point, it is still capable of. So Florovsky wrote about this as well, about this general feeling of downfall and demise that seems to penetrate and paralyze us, because we don't want to touch anything. Things that need to be touched, things that need to be updated. So I just want to throw that out there in case, in case you weren't thinking that yet, and if you want to disagree later, that's fine. Okay, so I'm moving on. The canonical codex we have, as you know, was completed 1,130 years ago. So produced over 1,000 years ago, by the year 883. This legislation is considered, in texts that we read, I quote, strictly binding, in full force, for the entire Orthodox Church today. And you can have different commentators, however, that is in black and white. They are considered binding. And then, as you know, it's been quoted many times, since the Council of Trullo, the canons are even deemed sacred, divine, and hence permanent and rigid, from which we refrain from adding or removing anything. So that's where we stand. This is officially the stance of the Church. But how can this be so? How can something be strictly binding, something like this, and completely inalterable, something that speaks to the life, the everyday life of Christians? Now, I'll have to leave aside, there are various opinions on this. There are theologians who point to the temporal aspect of the canons, and this audience will know about these various opinions. But I just want to point out something that hasn't been mentioned, that when the Saints Cyril and Methodius were translating texts for the newly baptized Slavs, there was a translation by Saint Methodius called the Syntagma of Methodius, which was the canonical codex for the Slavs for many centuries. Now, it's an interesting fact that Saint Methodius selected canons that he thought were necessary for these newly baptized peoples, and what he came up with and what functioned in this area of the Slavs was only 50% of the original Greek text. I have the exact list of what he used, but he omitted things like 34 canons of St. Basil. He omitted 70 canons of local synods, 22 canons of ecumenical councils, and 10 canons of the Holy Apostles were things that he simply did not deem necessary to translate. Now, he did not consider that the canonical codex was something he couldn't touch or from which he could not omit. Nonetheless, we all know that a more widespread idea among the Orthodox today seems to be of the complete rigidity of the Church's canonical legislation. We are all raised this way and taught. And unfortunately, this idea has been coupled with this vision of the full force of the canons, which inspires not church unity, but for many to break away from the Church because they perceive some kind of uncanonical activity of the Church hierarchy. Now, I take the liberty of calling this vision tendentious because it is selective, as many of you will know. One professes an unfaltering loyalty to certain canons. For example, Canon 45 of the Holy Apostles, that forbids prayer with heretics, is a big favorite. And they remain, these people who break away from the Church, for accusations of the hierarchy and being uncanonical in one way. These same people won't be disturbed by other canons, a multitude of canons that haven't been upheld by the Orthodox Church for centuries. Now, one group of such self-professed true Orthodox went so far as to add the following anathema to their celebration on what they think is for them the Sunday of Orthodoxy. I quote, "To those who mindlessly say that some of the canons of the Holy Councils and the Holy Fathers are old and not important for our salvation, anathema." So this is what they perceive as heresy. If you consider any of the canons old and not important for our salvation. Now, the fact that it is a fact that we do not uphold many canons, it does implicitly say that they are old and not important for our salvation. That's just what we're saying. We might not articulate that. Now, in what follows, I shall offer a few reflections on this question. I would like to reflect a little bit on the term canon, just to offer some reflections on it, sort of an exegetical attempt, and to understand the function of canons in our tradition. And then just look at a few, I will omit many that I mention here, that are not upheld by the Church, and see what that means for our for what it says about how we see our canonical tradition. Okay. Now, the definition of canon is something you'll have to ask me during the break because I don't have time for it. But let's take a look at, I will say it briefly. If we see the term canon as something that is a measure. Yes, you know the meaning of measuring stick. Or if we call a saint like Saint Nicholas, kanona pisteos, this is something that inspires us. It doesn't mean that everybody exactly, necessarily has a white beard and dresses the way Saint Nicholas did, nor that they lead the exact life. It means that this is something inspiring, something that can possibly serve as a measure of piety. Now, this kind of freedom is given within the canons because in the canonical legislation there were laws, that which was issued by the emperors, the normi or normima, and the canons were distinguished from what was considered a law. So there's a certain freedom given to the hierarchy and leaders of the church to use canons as instruments. They are instruments. They don't fetter the church. They don't chain the church within certain boundaries. They're instruments. And towards the definition of economia, I did not hear it here, but economia is often falsely juxtaposed to akrivia. However, if you read closely when the word occurs in various texts, including the canonical texts, economia is actually the goal of the instruments that are the canons. It is the building up of the house of God, and everything has to serve economia, the house building of God. So the judgment of whether a canon is implemented or not, basically the judgment is, does it build up or does it destroy? And within that parameter, the church has a lot of freedom. Anyway, let's just mention quickly several canons, I will be brief, that we do not uphold. For example, in the area of liturgy, we will be familiar with the fact that there's a canon of the Council of Laodicea, which has a lot of interesting liturgical legislation. Canon 15 forbids anyone to sing in church who is not ordained to do so. Of course, we don't uphold that in most of the Orthodox churches I know of anyway. Then we haven't already mentioned Canon 69 of Trullo, which forbids all laity to enter the sanctuary. It has already been mentioned that women usually do not overstep this boundary. However, I have never seen a parish in which the canon is upheld for men. And then the most popular canon of Dionysius, Canon 2 of Alexandria, which the paper just before lunch discussed, the excellent paper we heard today, that forbids a woman to enter a church. I just want to add one thing to the discussion analysis already offered, that it's interesting to me how we deal with this canon, because we are very aware of the existence of this canon. However, most priests do reform this canon, because if you read it, you really can't enter a church in this state. However, most priests will allow women to enter a church. They just don't allow them to go to communion. So what I want to say is that we are implicitly criticizing the canon. You are modifying what Dionysius said. And what's interesting to me is that this kind of criticism in practice seems to be allowed, but the minute you want to theologically analyze what we're doing, this is not allowed. You're allowed to change canons and not follow them and modify them and criticize them in practice, but the minute you say something about them, this is considered some kind of I don't know what. In the worst case, feminism. Yes, I know, I'm finishing. So then just a final note. We have the canon. The problem with that canon is, of course, then it's when it finishes with calling the woman not completely clean in body and soul, is that there's a theological problem. That's the problem with the canon. And so in principle, the church doesn't agree with it theologically. And then the canon that I will mention is, you know that there's a canon that's not directly related to liturgy, but the church would not agree with it today in principle. The canon of the second synod of 879 in the Hagia Sophia, it is the second canon that proclaims the incompatibility of monasticism with the hierarchical rank. A bishop can't be a monk. And it explicitly says, this is Canon 2 of the Council in Hagia Sophia, it says that a bishop, because of the obligation of obedience and penance in monasticism, that these two are incompatible because the bishop is the boss of everybody. So obviously we don't follow this canon. In fact, in principle it's wrong. So to conclude, I have several other examples of canons that actually really, strictly speaking, can't be called canons anymore, because it's not just that we don't follow them, because for practical reasons. It's that the Church no longer agrees with them in principle, and something like economia, regardless of how you define it, doesn't accommodate a canon that's wrong in principle. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, this confronts us with the very awkward fact, like also that canon that we heard today about against bathing with the Jews and befriending Jews. There are principles here that the Church would not agree with today. Now, what do you do with canons that are no longer really fit to be called canons? This really faces us with the necessity to be able to say, but we tie our hands when we call the canons, you know, second to Holy Scripture, and raise them up to what they are not, because to change them would mean that you are, you know, as if you're actually changing the substance of our faith. And this is the issue at hand, and the final issue is that they actually lead to a disruption of church unity. They don't serve church unity. They are an excuse for people to leave the church. This kind of false understanding of canons. Thank you.